Good afternoon and welcome. I'm George Beebe. I'm the Vice President and Director of Studies at the Center for the National Interest. And it's my pleasure to welcome you all to this panel discussion this afternoon of the triangular relationship between the United States, China, and Russia. I'd like to just remind our audience a little bit of recent American diplomatic history. After Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger engineered Washington's opening to China, it became an axiom within the US foreign policy establishment that the United States should have better relations with Beijing and with Moscow than they had with each other. And for many decades, this was true. But recently, it has clearly not been. Today, there's no doubt that Russia and China have much better relations with each other than either of them have with the United States. And unfortunately, much of their cooperation is actually aimed at constraining or opposing American interests. And this has been particularly noticeable in recent weeks amidst the COVID-19 pandemic. Russia has been among China's most vocal defenders against American accusations of creating or mishandling the outbreak of COVID-19, and against US calls for punitive measures against Beijing. And China, in turn, has been one of the most enthusiastic purchasers of Russian oil since the global downturn in oil prices. And this has been an important factor in helping Russia's energy sector. So the question that we'd like to explore today is whether the current dynamics in the US-Russia-China triangle will necessarily continue. Could any factors, particularly in the wake of the pandemic, change the shape of this triangle and potentially improve US relations with either or both of these countries? And are any of these factors things that the United States could affect? So to answer these questions, we have with us today an outstanding panel of American and Russian experts. Stapleton Roy is the former US ambassador to China, the former Assistant Secretary of State, and somebody that I regard as the Dean of US experts on China. Paul Heer is my current colleague at the Center for the National Interest, and my former colleague in the US intelligence community, where he served as the National Intelligence Officer for China and East Asia for many years. And joining us from Russia are two experts from the Higher School of Economics in Moscow. Aleksey Maslov is one of Russia's top experts on China, and Dmitry Suslov is one of Russia's most insightful experts on relations with the United States and on Russia's geopolitical strategy. Thank you all for joining us today. I want to start out by asking each of our panelists to give some brief opening remarks. And then once our panelists are done, we're going to move to a question and answer session where the audience will have an opportunity to submit questions by using the Q&A function, which is on the lower part of your Zoom screen. And I'd like to start out by offering the floor to Stapleton Roy. Stape, the floor is yours.
Thank you, George. Our topic is the dynamics of US-China-Russia relations. It's a subject dear to my heart. In July 1971, I was working in the US Embassy in Moscow when US National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger unexpectedly showed up in Beijing to pave the way for a visit by President Nixon. This diplomatic tour de force sent shockwaves around the world, but there was no place in the world where the shockwaves are greater than in Moscow. Overnight, from being denied access to Soviet China specialists, I found suddenly that I was in demand for meetings with Soviet officials who wanted to know what the United States was up to. Of course, at the time, I didn't have a clue what we were up to, but it looked as though it was a positive move from our standpoint. 9 years later, I was working in the US Embassy in Beijing when we sent a message to Washington reporting that Soviet US-Chinese relations were on the path toward normalization. The message was totally ignored in Washington since it coincided with the Soviet intrusion into Afghanistan, which set back the Sino-Soviet normalization process for about half a decade. But toward the end of the 1980s, sure enough, Soviet-Chinese relations began to normalize so rapidly that the US intelligence community was taken by surprise. I can tell you some anecdotes with respect to that, just to show that we really were not prepared in Washington at the pace that they improved. In looking back, we can see that contrary to the views of some US Soviet specialists at the time, the US breakthrough with China actually enhanced Soviet incentives to improve relations with the United States. But it also enhanced, and this was less well appreciated, Beijing's interest in improving relations with Moscow. As seen in Chairman Mao's complaints during the 1970s, that the United States was simply standing on the shoulders of China to get at the Soviet Union. Chinese strategists understood this dynamic and concluded that normalizing relations with the Soviet Union would make China less vulnerable to manipulation by the United States. During this period, the United States was in the driver's seat in terms of managing the dynamic of the three-way interactions among Washington, Moscow, and Beijing. This is no longer the case. Policy errors by the United States in handling relations with both Moscow and Beijing have pushed China and Russia closer together. In addition, the emergence of the United States as the sole superpower in 1991 created a strong strategic incentive for Beijing and Moscow to improve relations because of their shared belief that a multipolar world was more compatible with their interests than a unipolar one. By 2014, Sino-Russian relations were strong and healthy, the best in modern history. Ideological competition was no longer a factor. Both Moscow and Beijing felt threatened, as I mentioned, by a world dominated by a sole superpower and by US support for color revolutions in the countries of the former Soviet Union. They also shared a common interest in managing relations in Central Asia together. They resolved their border disputes. They worked together in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization to manage their relations in Central Asia. And China, while it disapproved of the Soviet response in 2014, respected Russian primary interests in the Ukraine. And Russia felt comfortable in reserving certain areas of cooperation with China that they did not wish to push ahead on, such as cooperation in energy, and they did not immediately embrace the Belt and Road Initiative when Xi Jinping launched the idea in 2013 in Kazakhstan. This changed in 2014, when the United States celebrated the ouster of the moderately pro-Russian president in Ukraine in favor of a successor more inclined to seek closer ties with the EU and NATO. China disapproved of the Russian countermeasures of annexing the Crimea and stirring up problems in eastern Ukraine, but it refrained from public criticism out of respect for Russian dominant interests there, just as Russia respects China's dominant interests in North Korea. At present, Sino-Russian relations are strong, based on common strategic interests and parallel approaches to many international issues. But they are what I would call unhealthily close. This is because Russia's confrontation with NATO over Ukraine has forced Moscow to compromise its strategic reservations over China's growing economic ascendancy over Russia and its expanding influence and involvement in Central Asia. This situation would be ripe for exploitation by a United States capable of managing a sophisticated foreign policy. Unfortunately, this is not the case at present. This is partly because of failures of US leadership and the dysfunctionality in the US political system, as well as the cumulative impact of 4 US presidents in a row, lacking experience and background in foreign affairs and national security strategy. So this is a situation where we have fostered a natural process of closer relations between Moscow and Beijing once the ideological competition was removed from the equation, but we have also pushed them closer together, and after 2014, we pushed Russia into a closer embrace with Beijing than the Russians are comfortable with. But we are ill-positioned to exploit that situation. The coronavirus problem is not going to overcome that problem. All three of us have made major mistakes in responding to the coronavirus. Beijing is the only one of the three that, despite its initial mistakes, ended up taking effective measures that have brought the epidemic, what appears to be, under semi-control inside China, whereas the United States and Russia are still struggling with an expansion of the infections that is not yet brought under control. But there are other areas of foreign policy where, if we were skillful in understanding where we had common interests with Russia and with China, instead of seeing both relationships as fundamentally competitive at their core, we would be able to have a better position in the three-way triangle. At the moment, we are the worst positioned in the trilateral triangle, and I think that's going to continue for the foreseeable future.
All right, Steve, thank you very much. I think you've done a good job of teeing this up and started to provoke a little bit of thought. And I'd like to follow up on some of what you said during the questions and answers. I'd like to now give the floor to Aleksey Maslov.
Well, thank you very much. Well, I'd like to point out several milestones of the Russian-Chinese relations right now in this changing situation. First of all, usually we speak about the common interest, political and economic interest between Russia and China. But I think maybe more correct to speak about the common feelings, because both China and Russia both feel offended, and they share the same mentality that the present day global situation is unfair toward to Russia and both to China. And Russia and China should take much more, higher place in this world, first of all, in the economic, financial, banking system, etc., etc. So the first milestone of this so-called cooperation, it's a common feelings and common mentality. The second point today, second milestone, today several times we mentioned about the triangle, Russia, China, United States. But as far as I understand, from Chinese point of view, it's not a triangle. There are two superpowers like United States and China and Russia, which should support Chinese approach and Chinese political mentality. It's a Chinese approach, not Russian approach. Russia, should take as a place as a third leg to this table to make this world more stable. And we can see that when we speak about the cooperation and Belt and Road Initiative, from Chinese point of view, Russia, it's a part of this Belt and Road Initiative. But from Russian point of view, Russia considers Belt and Road Initiative as a very good, very stable, but Chinese initiative. And Russia could not be a part of the Chinese initiative and Chinese project, because Russia has its own project, like Big Eurasia or Eurasian Economic Union, which is not the same as a Belt and Road Initiative. These two initiatives, two projects, could overlap each other, but it's not the same. And if we look to the real cooperation, we can see that we can see the huge cooperation in this field. When we speak about that Russia and China are best partners to each other, it's correct. But first of all, in the sense of the bilateral trade. But if you look to the Chinese investments, foreign direct investments from China to Russia, we can see that these investments are not very high. The accumulated investments from the 1991 up to the present day, it's close to be $30 billion. So it's not, it's accumulated investments, so it's not very high. It's, well, almost the same level of investments as China invests for 1 year to European Union. So that's, I think it's some kind of, some point of the mistrust to each other. The third mile point, which is very successful both to Russia and China want and could cooperate in the military field. Because for both countries, military cooperation is very important. And both countries look to the military cooperation as a future step for the world leadership. That's the third mile point. The third mile point that Russia and China right now were brought much closer together. First of all, because of the, well, United States pressure both to Russia and to China. And Russia and China became much more friendly to each other and started to discuss much more tiny questions and sensitive questions. First of all, about the comprehensive security in East Asia, the comprehensive security as a global security. All these topics were never discussed before the pressure of the United States to both countries. So it means that Russia and China, step by step, are trying to work out the common platform, a common ground for the future cooperation. At the same time, Russia wants to play an independent role as an independent center for the global security. And there is one very important point which distinguishes Russia from China and vice versa. China today has its own global project, which is Belt and Road Initiative. Well, it's not just an infrastructural initiative, but also includes many other factors like political factor and financial, etc., etc. Russia right now just is at the point of the developing its own global ideas. And in these ideas in the future could not coincide with the Chinese ideas. So maybe it could be a future point of, say, misunderstanding or the point of frictions for the future. But anyway, right now, China and Russia both feel very insecure at the present day situation. So I think it could be a very good platform for the future military and maybe economic cooperation. And once again, maybe for the development of the common financial and maybe common currency platform. So maybe Russia and China will move toward to the development of its own alternative way of the money transfer and maybe to building a so-called the second line for the development. One more, and my last question for today. I think that Russia could be a third center of power, not pro-Chinese and not pro-US, but as a center of power for countries which are not satisfied by the US or by China umbrella. So for Russia, it's very good. It's a very good point of development because Russia, in this case, could stay a little bit apart from the clash between United States and China. Thank you very much.
Very good. Thank you. I'd now like to give the floor to Paul Heer.
Thank you, George. Thank you very much. I very much appreciate the opportunity to participate, and I appreciated the broad-ranging remarks that Stapleton and Aleksey just made. I'm going to talk a little more specifically about the context of the COVID-19 virus and what I see are some of its potential implications for the triangular relationship. I do think on the core question that we've been talking about that there is some potential, at least, for some realignment of the US-Russia-China triangle, at least incrementally, in the wake of COVID, largely because Russia and the United States now have something in common with regard to China. They're both grappling, as I think you mentioned, George, with serious public health crises for which Beijing bears at least some responsibility. I want to start, though, by noting that in the discussion over the past several years about the closeness of the China-Russia relationship. As a historian, I have generally found myself on the minority side of the discussion by thinking more about the potential fault lines between Beijing and Moscow than the reasons for their cooperation, although I certainly acknowledge that the reasons for the cooperation has been considerable. But I actually think, and this has been alluded to briefly, I think that some of the latent tensions in that relationship have become more important over the past decade because of the growing imbalance within the relationship as a result of the so-called rise of China and the perceived relative decline of Russia. And we all know that the Chinese think very much in terms of what they call comprehensive national power. I think that as much as Beijing values its relationship with Russia, the Chinese, frankly, incrementally or increasingly see Moscow as the junior partner in the relationship. At the very least, I think they probably calculate that China doesn't need Russia as much as Russia needs China. And to the extent that this is true, I presume that it's annoying to the Russians, to Moscow, who remembers when it was the senior partner in the relationship. I also think that the Chinese privately are somewhat uncomfortable. I think Aleksey just alluded to a piece of this with some of Russia's international behavior, which in some ways is more arguably revisionist and confrontational toward the United States than China has thought it was advisable to be, at least until very recently. What I mean here is that the Chinese are not as uncomfortable with their global position as Russia appears to be. Because from Beijing's perspective, the balance of power in the world and influence is trending in China's favor. And Beijing has generally wanted to avoid being seen as overplaying its hand or reacting too impulsively. And for this reason, I actually suspect that the Chinese are not wholly comfortable when Washington portrays lumps Beijing and Moscow together as posing the same kind of threat to the United States as the Trump administration has since the National Security Strategy of 2017. And finally, I think both Stape and Aleksey mentioned this. The Belt and Road Initiative, I think, fits into this equation because I think China's pursuit of the Belt and Road has planted some seeds of more tension between Moscow and Beijing, certainly than either side is willing to acknowledge or discuss, simply because it represents, in part, China's efforts to build a sphere of influence in areas that have historically been Russia's sphere of influence. So this is the context in which I see the potential for movement to the points in the strategic triangle, or at least the dimensions of the triangle in the wake of COVID. Now, George, you mentioned it's certainly true that Moscow has emerged in the last several weeks as one of Beijing's defenders against the criticism, certainly that's been emanating from Washington of China's handling of the virus. And this, of course, is an example which you, I think Staple also mentioned, of something we've seen frequently in the past 2 years. The United States providing excuses or reasons for China and Russia to stand together and to find ways to score points against Washington together. But what interested me, at least momentarily, was the similarity between the Russian and American responses to COVID-19 in the early stages, particularly with regard to China. As we know, because the Chinese were slow in acknowledging and warning about human-to-human transmission of the virus and in restricting travel out of Wuhan, Russia, like the United States, expressed some concern about the lack of information and transparency from Beijing about the virus. And as soon as the risks became clear, Russia, again, like the United States, restricted Chinese from entering their country. I should note that in addition to this, in both countries, Russia and the United States, some fear of Chinese who were potentially carrying the virus fueled some suspicions that were predictably but unfortunately had some racial undertones. There reportedly was some tension. I'm curious what Dmitry and Aleksey can say about this tension between Beijing and Moscow over Russia's efforts to quarantine or deport Chinese nationals. My point here is simply that Russia shares some of the United States' concerns about how Beijing has managed COVID-19 and failed to minimize the spread of the virus. But as I said earlier, as I already noted, this was followed very shortly by the escalation of US charges against China, which Stape alluded to, which frankly were driven as much by an effort to divert attention from Washington's own botched initial reactions to the virus as it was by Beijing's culpability in its spread. In any event, this obviously gave Moscow the opportunity to come to Beijing's defense, and since then, Moscow has been criticizing the US narrative and cooperating with Beijing's efforts to deal with the virus multilaterally. And we obviously saw this on Monday earlier this week after Xi Jinping's appeal to the World Health Assembly, which appears at least initially to have scored points, frankly, against the United States by eliciting wide international support from the Russians, certainly, but I would also note from some US allies as well. So again, as I suggested earlier, Washington has again reinforced the rationale for Russia and China to come together. Now, it may be that because of this dynamic, the opportunity for any greater cooperation between Russia and the United States has already been lost. But the bottom line here, I think, is that Russia and the United States still share a vital interest in requiring China to take further steps toward more transparency and clarity in accounting for the origins of the virus and in accounting for Beijing's actions during December and January in warning the rest of the world about the potential threat. And in that regard, I'd be surprised if Moscow itself was wholly persuaded by Beijing's narrative about its response to the virus, which has sidestepped some of those questions about whether and how China might have done more in the early stages to minimize the impact. So looking forward, I think we were asked to discuss what variables might be in the future trend lines. I think I would cite three variables that I think will determine whether there is an opportunity here for Washington and Moscow or a change in the relationship. Right? The first, I think, obviously, would be the course of the virus within Russia. If the infection rates and death rates in Russia continue to increase and the economic impact inside Russia becomes more severe, I would expect this to reinforce concerns there in Moscow about the transparency and accuracy of Beijing's narrative on the virus. Secondly, and again, this gets back to the point that was made about the Belt and Road Initiative by both Stape and Aleksey. My guess is that Moscow will be particularly attentive to how Beijing's relief efforts and its diplomatic narrative are faring in some of the Belt and Road countries, which, as I noted earlier, would imply an enhancement of Beijing's reputation and influence, not only at the expense of the United States, but potentially at the expense of Russia as well. But I think, to round it out, I think the third and most important variable will be whether the United States continues its current acrimonious approach to China and continues to characterize Russia and China is working in tandem to undermine U.S. interest and security. I think that this would only encourage them to actually do so at the expense of potential improvement in U.S.-Russia relations, and I might add at the expense of encouraging a Russian foreign policy that's less dependent on China. The last point I'll make is that, obviously in an ideal world, now would be the time for Beijing and Moscow and Washington to be working in tandem to lead the process of developing a vaccine that can protect all of us from COVID-19. But unfortunately, I think the level of animosity and competition on the legs of the triangle makes it hard for us to be optimistic on that score. And with that, I'll turn it back to George.
Okay, thank you, Paul. And I think that's an excellent point that we all, despite the tensions in the various relationships within the triangle, have some common interests that are important to bear in mind. And dealing with common threats such as this disease is certainly one of them. Dmitry Suslov, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, George. Great to be here. My pleasure. My approach towards the COVID pandemics is that it accelerates rather than changes the major global trends, including the trend of the US-China competition becoming a full-fledged comprehensive confrontation and a major axis of the international system for at least the first quarter of the 21st century. Thus, since it is an accelerator, not a game changer, I do not expect any fundamental changes in the US-Russia-China triangle and no major changes in Russia's relations with both China and the United States. This triangle will obviously remain not equidistant. Russia will continue to have strategic partnership with China, but not a military alliance. And intensity of the Russian-Chinese relations will only grow in the observable future. And Russia will have confrontation with the United States, which is unlikely to decrease in the short-term future. At the same time, I do expect some shifts in Russian foreign policy beyond this triangle, beyond the relations with the US and China. Because of the changing global environment. In particular, I anticipate Russian policy towards India, towards West European countries, and perhaps Japan to become more proactive, flexible, and positive. I won't talk much about Russia-China relations because Professor Maslov is a much greater expert on that than I am, and he described it brilliantly. But let me say that the pandemic increases Russian and Chinese mutual dependence on each other. And I would disagree that, Russia depends, of course, mathematically, Russia depends on China much more than China depends on Russia, but geopolitically, the picture is not as simple. Yes, of course, the China's share in Russian trade and foreign investment is likely to grow further. And the Russian-Chinese positive cooperation during the pandemic and total absence of public accusations, and even if there were private discontent, Russia and China are very brilliant in handling this and making a very good public appearance. So there were no public mutual accusations. And very close positions on many things, including fight against pandemics itself, will have an impact on Russian foreign policy. Also let me say that one of the impacts of these pandemics is psychological. You shouldn't underestimate that. And psychologically, this pandemic sharpened the perception of who is your friend and who is your enemy in this world. And for Russia, the answer is absolutely obvious. At the same time, since the American pressure on China increases, and now there is no doubt that no matter who wins in Washington, in the United States in November, the American confrontational policy towards China will increase and continue. China also depends on Russia. China will not simply afford of remaining alone. Thus, I'm talking about mutual dependency and the mutual interest in preserving the relations. At the same time, there are, of course, matters of concern for Russia regarding China. First, the pandemic accelerates formation of a world with two superpowers, which are much more powerful than any other center of power, including Russia. So Russia is visibly becoming a second-tier power. A great power, without question, but a second-tier country, which is psychologically uncomfortable. And this makes Russia closer to Europe, by the way, not to the United States. Second, China visibly rejects the remnants of Deng Xiaoping wisdom of hiding strengths, and China is behaving as a confident and assertive great power, even I would say as a teenager great power, which has already realized its strength, but still hasn't learned how to behave. As for the first challenge, Russia will react to that with intensifying relations with other players. India, perhaps even Japan. Russian policy towards China is already a policy of balancing. Russia is balancing its strategic partnership with China with deepening partnerships with the others. And now this balancing policy will simply become more intensive. Ideally, of course, Russia would want to have better relations with the United States too, without undermining its partnership with China. So for Russia, it's not a matter of either or, of course. But improvement of relations with the United States is viewed as simply impossible for the observable future. Also, Russia will certainly intensify relations with those countries who do not want to make a strategic choice between the United States and China, who wants to preserve their independence. So Russia is very likely to position itself as a sovereignty and independence enabler for these countries who do not want to choose either or. Russia will position itself as a partner for them, which can help them to avoid either American or Chinese hegemony while not falling into the Russian hegemony, because simply, of course, Russia does not have resources to impose a hegemony of its own outside of the former USSR. As for the second challenge, well, Russia will watch how the Chinese assertiveness and leadership evolves. whether it is depicted and directed vis-a-vis Moscow and Central Asian countries, countries of the Eurasian Economic Union. If yes, then it will become a problem for Russia, but because of the increasing confrontation between the United States and China, this risk is viewed as unlikely, at least for now. Now some words about the US-Russian relations. You know, for Moscow, it is already absolutely obvious that strengthening of the US-China confrontation does not decrease the US-Russian confrontation. The US is committed to the policy of dual confrontation. This commitment is bipartisan, and this commitment is expected to continue no matter who wins in November. And the latest T-family report of the US State Department on competitive policy vis-a-vis China and Russia, who are thus depicted as an integral challenge, is a vivid illustration to this approach. Both a second Trump and a Biden administration are believed in Russia to continue this policy of dual confrontation with Russia and China. With nuances, of course, but essentially the dual containment will continue. And this obviously brings Russia and China closer together, which appears contrary to the long-term interests of the United States, but it is so only if the United States considers Russia as a great power. And here lies, I think, the problem, because the majority of the American mainstream refuses to regard Russia as a great power. A more flexible policy towards which much would make sense to contain the greater competitor and adversary, as the United States did with Maoist China in 1970s to contain the Soviet Union. Instead, Russia is regarded as a declining power, which existing political regime is claimed to be doomed for failure, which foreign policy is claimed to be costly and unsustainable, and which sooner or later will start regarding China, not the West, as the major security and perhaps existential challenge. And from this perspective, which I think is fundamentally false and flawed, Russia is expected to return to the Western orbit on its knees as a prodigal son sooner or later. In the meantime, Russia is regarded as a second adversary, which is much more fragile than the first adversary, and elimination of this second fragile adversary would help the US to deal with the first adversary. So Russia seems to be regarded as a sort of Austria-Hungary, you know, of World War I, and China as the German Empire. Such perception creates incentives for increase, not decrease, but increase of the US pressure on Russia, as the United States begins the long-term confrontation with China and the struggle for global leadership with China. Moreover, you know better than I do that domestic factors in the United States prevent any improvement of the US policy towards Russia. Although the Russian interference is no longer the most dominant topic of the US campaign, it still exists. And the COVID pandemics transformed the topic of Russian interference into a broader topic of Russian disinformation campaign. And this domestic limitation will also remain, no matter who wins in November. Now, without question, Russia does try to use the COVID pandemic to get at least some elements of cooperation with the United States. And of course, strategically, Russia is interested in making US-Russian relations, although competitive but healthier, a healthier competition for the sake of balance in Russian foreign policy and for the sake of Russia's long-term survival as an independent great power. So now Russia is very proud already now that counter-terrorist dialogue with the Trump administration has been resumed, that some bilateral micro-cooperation happened on the COVID pandemic. Russia is very interested in prolongation of the New START. Russia has very big expectations from the P5 summit this November, if it happens. So there is a hope, by the way, in Moscow still there is a hope that a second Trump administration, if Trump is re-elected for the second term, could bring some elements of improvement in the US-Russian relations, because in his second term, Trump will be less dependent on the domestic constraints. But at the same time, there is a cold-minded understanding in Moscow that Russia will still be regarded as a second adversary, by the second Trump administration, and the nature of the relations will remain confrontational. If Biden wins this November, then US-Russian relations will deteriorate further, because the US will regard Russia not just as geopolitical, but also an ideological adversary. And Biden's rhetoric on Russian domestic politics, on Putin himself, will be quite harsh. Moreover, and this might be even more important, with Biden in the White House, the US allies in Europe and in Asia will have less incentives for independent positive outreach towards Moscow, such as Macron's initiative, which is bad for Russia. So if Biden wins, Russia will consolidate with China even more, even despite the concerns that Russia has with the Chinese policy potentially. And Russia's balancing with other powers will be even more difficult. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dmitry, and thanks to all the panelists. I think you've given us an awful lot of food for thought here. I'd like to open the question period of this by beginning with a question from a former US ambassador to the United Nations, John Negroponte, who asks, would it be useful sometime in the near future to hold a summit of the P5 countries at the head of government level? Who would like to tackle this? Dmitry, you alluded to a P5 meeting in November.
Can you please repeat the question, because I had some problems with the communication, so I didn't hear what you say, what you've just said.
Yes, the question is, would it be useful sometime in the near future to hold a summit of the permanent 5 countries at the head of government level?
Well, I think it would be useful, not just from the perspective of improvement of the triangular relations, and making Russia's relations with the United States and China more balanced, but from the perspective of peace, because it is clear that the intensifying confrontation between the United States and China and the United States and Russia, coupled with the deterioration of the remnants of arms control. By the way, today it was announced that the United States unilaterally pulls out from the Open Skies Treaty. And thrice we have an unstoppable sophistication of weapons, of the means to inflict strategic danger towards each other. It's no longer just nuclear weapons, but an abundance and diversity of weapons. This all makes the situation very risky. And we should think very seriously about the avoidance of war, and about creating a new architecture for sustaining of strategic stability. It is also obvious that the new start is the last start.
Let me take a different position on this.
Yeah,
I think such a meeting might be useful, but not now. I would say it should take place after the elections. I think that given the political dynamics in the United States and the approach that our president takes to discussing international issues, which is he doesn't like multilateral meetings, he prefers bilaterally dealing with leaders. So I think that the dangers of not improving the situation and making it worse are too great for the next 6 months. But that after that, I think that the idea of having a meeting among the big 5 might make some sense.
May I just finish what I was saying, and why I think it would make sense to make the summit now, not even waiting for the elections, because of the necessity to launch new negotiations about the new philosophy of arms control. As I said, the new start is the last start. There won't be start 4. And in order to deal with the current dangers, in order to deal with the today danger of great power war, we need to create a fundamentally new architecture of regimes, agreements, and a fundamentally new system of arms control. And the purpose of this P5 summit is precisely to declare that, right? And it is also obvious, at least for Russia, that Trump administration is likely to agree to extend the New START as an interim measure only if Russia and China claim that we commit ourselves, that we oblige ourselves to create a new, to start negotiations about the new multilateral arms control now, right? Not in the future, but already now. And such a declaration could be the major outcome of the P5.
I could suggest, I mean, I tend to agree with Dmitry on some of the issues that could usefully be addressed in a P5 context like that. But on balance, I'm inclined to agree with State that it might not be a good idea in the near term for two reasons. One, I mean, given the level of gamesmanship and animosity and hostility even among the parties, it's hard for me to contemplate how they could reach agreement on what the agenda for such a meeting would be. And two, frankly, I would have low confidence that President Trump would perform effectively in support of U.S. national interests in such a forum.
It's scary when you talk. I agree with your point, Dmitry. The substance of your point, I think, is accurate. But when you say the philosophy of arms control, I shudder. Because quite frankly, at the top levels of our government now, to speak in terms of the philosophy of arms control makes no sense.
All right, well, here we have a good example of the intersection of the personal dynamics of particular leaders and the national interests of great powers. They don't always coincide very harmoniously. We have another question from Dov Zakheim, former Undersecretary of Defense, who asks about a particular area of the world in which we have some competing great power interests, and that's the Arctic. And he asks, how does Russia view China's increasing interest in the Arctic?
Well, well, first of all, I think that, I know that this cooperation in Arctic issue between Russia and China started about 10 years ago. And during these 10 years, all these 10 years long, Russia and China tried to find a balance between interests of these two countries. Because China could not survive in Arctic just alone, and without the Russian support. And Russia idea, okay, let's build a joint Arctic way, or the so-called the third road, well, Belt and Road, and also once again one more Arctic road. And let's invest to this new Arctic road altogether. But Chinese approach is a little, not a little bit, but a lot, different, and Chinese idea that Russia could just provide, for example, to provide some icebreakers and to provide some Russian experience in this field, but China should be a only investor to this point, and only in under these conditions China could invest to the Arctic way. I think that right now we're speaking about the Arctic infrastructure. Besides this Arctic infrastructure, Russia and China during the last 3 or 4 years discussed the idea of the gas and oil exploration along this way. That's a very interesting point, because in the real sense, Russia and China already got the agreement about this exploration, and Russia and China already explore the Yamal liquid gas exploration. Yamal is the name of this exploration. And right now, Russia and China, the last year, signed a new agreement about this called the Arctic 2. It's also a liquid gas field with the Novatek, Russian company Novatek from Russian side, and Chinese CCNP from Chinese side. But the question is, first of all, the question who will invest. It should be only China or Russia and China. And another way that Russia, as far as I understand right now, doesn't want to lose its control over these over these fields. So we had, or I mean, Russia and China already had MOU about this Arctic 2 and Arctic 1 fields, but it's just MOU, not the final agreement. So right now we're still under the discussion, and the main point of the discussion is the point of the gas price. So right now, I think that the Arctic issue for Russia and China, it's just a very good platform for the future development, but not right now. I think there are much more rumors than the reality in this point.
Very good, thank you. We have a question from former US Ambassador to Azerbaijan, Richard Kozlarich, who asks, where does the US trade dispute with China fit into developing this trilateral relationship on strategic arms control? Anyone want to tackle that?
Yeah, I can see, but I can see this question in the list of questions.
It's hard to answer that.
Yeah.
Because quite frankly, I think the trade dispute with China and the launching of a tariff war with China, I think those decisions were taken without any regard to what potential connection there might be to disarmament discussions. So I have difficulty, since I don't think the administration made any connection between the two issues in formulating the trade strategy toward China, I have difficulty seeing how the two would fit together in this administration, as opposed to a different American administration where there might be more coherence in terms of understanding the interconnection of different foreign policy issues.
If I may, actually, I do see a connection and the linkage between them, and it is the following. You know, the trade dispute between the United States and China, from the Russian perspective, is just a tiny element. It is one of the elements of the U.S. confrontational approach towards China, which is much, much broader. And trade is not even the central element of this confrontational approach, but a component of this confrontational approach. And the logic of the US confrontation towards China, the perception of China as the major adversary, also necessitates the arms control. Because for the United States, since it regards China as the primary adversary, including a military adversary, it is simply unacceptable to have China without any limitations and to continue bilateral arms control with Russia without getting China involved.
Very good, thank you. We have a question from Nicholas Gvozdev, who's the former editor of the National Interest, now at the U.S. Naval War College. He asks, can anyone address the sentiment that the pandemic plus the oil crisis is likely to put push Russia out of the ranks of the great powers, and that China will be forced to deal with effective zero growth and rising unemployment and will have to pull back on its ambitions? So is the upshot of this American attitude something that will prevent any future US administration from reaching accommodations with either Beijing or Moscow?
Or Professor.
You can start, yeah.
I can deal with the first part of this question, and then Aleksey will deal with the second one. Obviously, as I said, the pandemics, accompanied by the collapse of the oil price, does increase the gap between it makes it much more visible between the United States and China on the one hand, and all the rest, including Russia, on the other hand. It is not just Russia who suffers from that, but many, many countries in the world. By the way, the Russian officialdom thinks that the Europeans will suffer economically much more than Russia because of the euro crisis, because of the pressure. Russia has much greater financial resources to survive actually the hard times, but the Europeans don't. And so on and so forth. And this is a challenge, and I referred to this challenge in my initial remarks. But having said that, And another implication of this obvious economic decline is that Russia will not afford any foreign policy moves that could have further costs on Russian foreign policy, such as, for instance, outright invasion in Ukraine, right? Without question, it could trigger a new round of sanctions against Russia, and Russia will try its best, to avoid such scenario. It does not mean that Russia will pull out from everywhere, including Venezuela, in Syria. Russia considers its presence in Venezuela and Syria as very low cost, by the way, even bringing economic benefits. But Russia will simply not take further risks that could result into greater Western pressure. But having said that, I disagree that it could make Russia, it could push Russia out from the list of the of great powers. Russian defense capabilities, conventional military capabilities, nuclear capabilities, and even relative economic capabilities and resources, plus Russian geopolitical position. And there is, at least seen from Moscow, we do see a growing demand on Russia in the world, precisely because of the US-Chinese confrontation. Because, as I said in my also initial remarks, many countries don't want to make this strict choice. And they do see Russia as a third power balancer, which is less dangerous than China and the United States, because Russia is much less powerful than China and the United States. So all this combined, of course, preserves Russia into the list of great powers, together with India, maybe, but of course, so far more powerful than India, but much weaker than the US and China. The US and China are superpowers, whereas Russia is a second-tier country, but not a third, fourth tier, but a second-tier country.
Yeah, may I add? Yeah. Well, first of all, I absolutely agree with Dmitry, and just my approach more from the Chinese point of view. First of all, sometimes we have too much simplistic point of view to the model of the economic development of China. First of all, I don't think that the rising in employment in China will in some way affect to the present day development of China, because Chinese power, Chinese government knows how to mitigate all these small and big contradictions in Chinese society. The second point, that the so-called the victory over the pandemic in China gave much more legitimization to the Xi Jinping himself and to the present day Chinese power. So the mutual trust, so cooperation between the Chinese power, Chinese authorities, and the Chinese people of China became much stronger. So I don't think that all these economic factors anyway will affect to the economic and political stability to China. Why for China it's so important to prove or to show that everything is just fine, not just in economic, but first of all in the field of pandemic of the COVID-19, etc., etc. Because China so far the only country who is a winner over this pandemic. And this is a great victory for Chinese government. And even today, you know that today we got we have a so-called the 2 sessions of the Chinese parliament, and today Xi Jinping spoke a lot about the victory over the disease, and it was presented as a great victory of the system, of the Chinese system. So I think that more United States will push to China, more legitimacy Chinese power will get from the point of the support from the Chinese people.
Let me weigh in on this. I think it's useful to look at worst case scenarios in terms of the recovery process in Russia, in China, and in the United States. But at the moment, frankly, we can't make intelligent estimates as to the likely outcomes. The United States at the moment is trying to get our economy restarted again, whereas our medical specialists are arguing we're relaxing the controls too early, and therefore we may see a resumption of the virus infections. We don't know whether that's the case. It is unprecedented in modern history for the United States to run $4 trillion to $5 trillion deficits in 1 year. We don't know whether our economy is going to be able to recover rapidly or struggle. China is now at a more advanced stage of trying to get its economy started again, but the estimates about China's possible growth this year range from low of 0 or negative growth to low single digits. China hasn't had growth that low in decades. So we don't know how what that will be. Russia is clearly, as our Russian friends have said, is suffering from low oil prices and the problems of the virus. So it's useful to consider these, but you can't consider them in isolation from each other. It's a different thing if Russia really struggles in recovering from the problems, but at the same time, the United States is really struggling as a result. For example, I don't understand how the US is going to formulate a sensible budget under situations where we are running $4 trillion deficits. What is the impact going to be on US military spending? I've seen an estimate of Chinese military spending this year, for example, that it might go down to 3%. Well, China's military budget has been growing generally at a rate in conformity with its rate of economic growth. But we don't know whether China is going to let it go down to 3% or not. So there are many unknown variables, but speculating about the mid outcomes, the good outcomes, and the bad outcomes, I think is worth the effort because our three countries are so important in terms of the global system.
In that regard, I would just add that I think, Beijing may yet be premature in having declared victory over COVID. I mean, I think that it's not entirely clear, as State just mentioned, how deep the economic impact might be and how long it will be. I think, I don't think that it will, in response to the question, I don't think that the economic impact is going to force the Chinese to abandon their ambitions. It may require them to shelve their capability to pursue some of them for a while, and that may lend itself to some reduction in tensions. It may also lend itself to Washington being able to develop a more objective estimate of what China's ambitions actually are. What the implications of that will be for the strategic triangle, I think, is hard to project. It just depends on. It'll be kind of issue specific.
Just a quick follow-up, because I see a potential difference on an important issue. Dmitry, you had made the point that you think it's a given, regardless of the outcome of the presidential election here in the United States in November, that the United States will continue to pursue a dual confrontation approach to dealing with Russia and China. But I think, as Stape has pointed out, we are almost certainly going to be in a situation where the United States has been wounded by the pandemic, wounded psychologically, probably wounded politically, exacerbating some of the political trends we've already been suffering from in the country, and also very seriously wounded economically. And under those circumstances, I wonder, is the United States going to continue to view its capabilities in the world and its objectives in the world in the same way, given that its capabilities to pursue those objectives are likely to be reduced? Is there, in other words, a greater possibility that the United States might not just continue doing the same dual confrontation approach that it's been pursuing in the future? I wonder if some of our American panelists might comment on that.
Thank you very much. Excellent question, George. I agree with you that some re-estimate of the US capabilities might be done next year, early next year, when we actually, now it's premature to talk about the economic consequences and the latitude of the economic consequences of the pandemics. Next year we will know what's the real hit, what's the real downturn caused by it, and what is the future of the global economic crisis. By the way, another factor that might at least mitigate this geopolitical calculus is the new Great Depression, Many economists claim that the current economic crisis that we're just entering in will be much, much more, deeper than the crisis of 2008, 2009. And what will be the consequence of that and the impact on that of this crisis on foreign policy, the future of globalization, the future of global interdependence, the future of American-Chinese interdependence, and so on and so forth. By the way, the previous Great Depression did not have a very positive impact on great power relations, as we all know. So yes, there might be many factors that might alter. But my point is very simple. I think that the US confrontation towards China is unavoidable. It is very strong and systemic. Nowadays, there is a very clear bipartisan consensus in the United States about that. The only difference basically between Trump administration and the possible Biden administration is how to include allies, American allies, into the confrontational policy towards China, not if this policy should remain confrontational. As for Russia, it is very hard for me to see how the United States could and why the United States, what is the rationale for the United States to try to bring Russia on its side? Now, first, it is impossible because Russia will not sacrifice its relations with China. That's just a mantra in Russian foreign policy. For the sake of what? And it will be very dangerous for Russia from all sorts of perspectives, starting with security. To have bad relations with such a giant across our border, under any scenario, we are interested in having friendship and friendly relations and partnership with China, not a confrontation. Secondly, domestic restraints in the United States that will persist. Third, what are the deliverables? What the United States could give Russia hypothetically in order to attract Russia, and can the price be affordable? So there are multiple of issues that would impede. This is why I think it is more prudent to talk about some elements of cooperation, some healthier relations between Russia and the United States, right? Not changing the overall nature of the relations, but including healthier dialogue and focusing on the issues where we do have common interests, avoiding war and elaborating a new system of strategic stability instead of the system that we inherited from the previous Cold War is a clear mutual interest, right? And by the way, Russia and the United States agree on many things here. Right? We also disagree with the endless continuation of the previous system. We also want the system to be modernized. Right?
I agree with Dmitry, but I would analyze it somewhat differently. I think your question is absolutely spot on. The dual confrontation strategy is unnecessary. Why do we have it? Because we are currently in an extreme version that we go into and out of, where we essentially have a domestically driven foreign policy. We're not looking at the external world objectively and formulating the best approach to advance US interests. We're looking at what we would like to have our druthers being. And our druthers would be to retain our position as the sole superpower in the world and pay whatever cost is necessary to keep that status. And anyone who challenges us on that, we're going to confront them on it. But we now are running unsupportable deficits in terms of supporting the type of global role that we have played before. And if we look externally, we find that a policy of confrontation. I was in a meeting this morning, for example, where one of our leading China experts said it's no longer a question of balancing cooperation and competition with China. He said it's a question of how to manage competition with China. In other words, cooperation has dropped out. Well, now, if you look at the external world, you find that we have no supporters for that approach in East Asia. None of our allies, none of the countries in East Asia are prepared to support a policy solely confrontation with China, no cooperation with China. So that is coming from our internal impulses. It has nothing to do with the objective world outside of the United States. And I think you could make the same argument. Dmitry was making that argument in terms of relations with Russia. There are many areas where we can find common interests with Russia, and one of them is avoiding war. But all we talk about is preparing for war rather than avoiding war. We would find that if we were to fund our diplomacy more and perhaps put less emphasis on finding military solutions to every political problem that we see around the world, it would be much cheaper and more effective foreign policy. But we are not looking at the external world to formulate our external policies. We're looking at our own navels and coming up with unrealistic concepts that we then try to get our allies to go along with. I think my statement about no cooperation, but only competition and confrontation would not get any more support in Europe than we would get in East Asia now. So I consider that type of an approach totally unsustainable, and that sooner or later we'll get away from it.
I couldn't agree more with that, because I think, George, the scenario you outlined for the United States is imminently upon us. I mean, even before the second Great Depression that's being induced by the pandemic hit, I think we were already only in the early stages of coming to grips with the fact that it's not 1945 anymore, or not even 1991 anymore. We simply do not, even before this, we did not have the capacity to conduct the kind of dual confrontation strategy that we got used to enjoying and affording over the course of the Cold War. So I think we're in for a rude awakening and a recognition that there are just limits. We're just not in the position to pursue that kind of strategy that we seem to think.
All right, well, thank you. Thank you all for what I think has been a very interesting discussion. I think we've only begun to scratch the surface of all the issues that we could be addressing under this topic. I'm sorry we've not been able to get to all the questions that have been answered, but I think it's better to leave people hungry for more discussion in the future. I want to thank not just our panelists, but also Russia's First Channel, which has helped immensely in organizing this event. And I look forward to future discussions on this topic and other related subjects. Thank you all.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.